It was a typical Wednesday evening in the quiet suburban neighborhood where Michael Thompson lived. The sun had set, casting a dim glow through the tall oaks lining the streets. The familiar hum of crickets filled the air, and porch lights flickered on, creating a comforting sense of routine. But inside Michael's home, something was far from ordinary. Michael, a 40-year-old entrepreneur, stood in the center of his living room, absently swirling a glass of scotch in his hand. His landscaping business had grown into a multi-million-dollar company over the years, a testament to his hard work and dedication. He had always been proud of what he'd built, both professionally and personally. His marriage to Sarah was another source of pride, 20 years of love, trust, and partnership. Or so he thought. Michael had always been the steady one, the rock. He prided himself on being kind and patient, someone his family could depend on. His two daughters, Emily and Olivia, were both in university now, leaving him and Sarah to adjust to an emptier, quieter home. Yet, lately, Michael felt something he couldn't quite put his finger on, an invisible distance, creeping into the spaces between them. Sarah had become different, detached, cold, distant in ways he hadn't noticed until recently. Sarah Thompson, 39, had always been independent, working in real estate and managing her own career. But something had changed in her since their daughters left for university. She smiled less, withdrew more. Michael had chalked it up to an adjustment period, empty nest syndrome, people called it. He had asked her several times if something was bothering her, but Sarah never gave a straight answer. Little did he know, Sarah had been battling a hidden depression, a feeling of emptiness that grew with each passing day. And there was something else, something Michael didn't know about, a man. Ryan Carter. A name Michael was soon to hear far too often. Ryan worked with Sarah at the real estate firm. A man in his mid-30s, married with 3 young daughters, he had become a confidant for Sarah in ways Michael couldn't. He was attentive, sympathetic, and most importantly, he offered an escape from the mundane life she felt trapped in. What Michael didn't know was that Ryan had a talent for spotting vulnerable women, preying on their emotional fragility for his own benefit. What started as innocent conversations at work had blossomed into something darker, something Michael was utterly unprepared for. As Michael took another sip of his scotch, oblivious to the storm brewing, Sarah sat upstairs in their bedroom. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, wrestling with guilt and excitement. Tomorrow night would be the night. She had already made the decision, though she hated herself for it. Tomorrow, she was going on a date with Ryan. One night, she told herself. One night to feel alive again, to escape the numbness that had taken hold of her life. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. Michael's brother, David, a detective, stepped inside. He had sensed something off with Michael recently, especially when they met for drinks last week. Michael, normally confident and secure, had seemed on edge, distracted. And tonight, that feeling was even more palpable. David glanced at his brother, who hadn't yet acknowledged his presence. "Mike," David said softly, breaking the silence. "You all right?" Michael shook his head as if pulling himself out of a trance. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." David didn't press further, though he suspected the real issue had to do with Sarah. He had always been protective of his brother, and lately, Sarah's strange behavior had raised red flags in his mind. He hadn't mentioned it to Michael yet, but he had hired a private investigator, James Foster, to follow Sarah and gather evidence of any potential wrongdoing. Michael didn't know this, yet. For now, Michael remained blissfully unaware, still trying to make sense of his wife's growing emotional distance. Tomorrow night, though, that ignorance would shatter in a way he could never have imagined. The clock ticked loudly, each second bringing Michael and Sarah closer to the breaking point neither of them saw coming. Thursday evening arrived like any other, yet the air in the Thompson household felt thicker, heavier with unspoken tension. Michael returned home from work later than usual, exhaustion evident on his face. He noticed that Sarah hadn't set the table for dinner, an unusual break from their routine. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that prickled at his nerves. Sarah sat at the kitchen counter, sipping a glass of wine. Her eyes were distant, her face framed with an expression Michael couldn't read, something between fear and resolve. She had rehearsed this moment in her head all day, yet the words still stuck in her throat. It was time, though. There was no turning back now. Michael placed his keys down and looked at her, sensing the unease in the room. "Everything all right?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She took another sip of wine, her hands trembling slightly as she set the glass down. She couldn't hold back anymore. It had to be tonight. "I need to talk to you," she said softly, her voice betraying the gravity of what was to come. Michael frowned, feeling a sudden weight pressing down on him. He sat across from her, his eyes searching hers for any clue as to what was going on. "What's this about?" There was a long pause before Sarah finally spoke, her voice shaking. I'm going on a date tomorrow night." Michael blinked, confused. He let out a short, nervous laugh. "A date? With who?" "Ryan," Sarah said, her voice just above a whisper. "My colleague." Time seemed to stop for Michael. His body went rigid, the glass of scotch slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. He didn't even register the sound. The woman he had loved for 2 decades, the mother of his children, was sitting here, telling him that she was going on a date with another man, tomorrow. His mind raced, trying to process what he'd just heard. You're joking, right?" Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm not, Michael. I know this sounds awful, but I need this. I've felt lost for so long. Ryan's helped me through things I haven't been able to talk to you about." The words hit Michael like a freight train. He struggled to breathe, feeling like the ground beneath him was falling away. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but he couldn't find his voice. All he could manage was a hoarse whisper. "How long?" "A few months," she admitted, her eyes cast downward in shame. "Nothing physical has happened, but I have feelings for him. I'm not asking for your permission, Michael. I just need this one night, for myself." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse ringing in his ears. The betrayal sliced through him like a knife. Sarah had been distant, yes, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this, a date with another man. After all they'd been through, after building a life together for 2 decades, she was telling him she needed someone else. For a moment, he thought he might vomit. He could feel the bile rising in his throat, his vision narrowing as anger and pain flooded his body. Yet he sat still, frozen in place, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what she was saying. He wanted to yell, to lash out, but instead, he felt numb. Without a word, Michael stood up and turned toward the door. He couldn't be here, couldn't look at her right now. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the weight of the situation hit him with full force. The woman he had trusted, loved, and shared his life with was slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was David. Michael answered without thinking. "Hey, I just wanted to check on you. Everything okay?" David's voice came through, casual but concerned. "No," Michael replied, his voice hollow. "Everything's not okay. Sarah, she's going on a date tomorrow night. With Ryan. Some guy from work." David fell silent on the other end, the shock registering. "Are you serious? Michael, you need to do something about this." Michael clenched his fist, trying to keep control of the emotions surging through him. "I don't know what to do." David's voice was sharp. "We've talked about this, Mike. I had a feeling something was off. That's why I hired James Foster. He's been tailing her for a few weeks now." "What?" Michael's blood ran cold. "I didn't want to tell you until I had something concrete," David continued. "But now? You need to get ahead of this. James will follow her tomorrow night. We'll know everything." Michael's mind whirled, his world crashing down around him. He hung up the phone without responding and walked to his car. He couldn't stay at the house tonight. He needed space to think, to process. Without a second thought, he booked a room at the most luxurious hotel in town, desperate for anything to dull the ache in his chest. Back in the house, Sarah stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the shards of broken glass on the floor, her heart heavy with guilt. She had done it. She had torn down the walls of their marriage with a few simple words. Yet as the initial wave of guilt passed, a strange calm settled over her. Tomorrow night would be her escape, just one night. She could still salvage her life afterward. Michael would forgive her. He always had. But Sarah had no idea what was coming next. And neither did Michael. The following morning, Michael woke up in his hotel room, the events of the previous night playing over and over in his mind like a haunting reel. His eyes were bloodshot, his mouth dry, but the pain in his chest was still raw and real. He could hardly believe that his life had spiraled so quickly out of control. Sarah's words echoed in his head, "I need this for myself." Rage, heartbreak, and confusion mixed inside him like a volatile cocktail. He had loved Sarah for 20 years, and now she was throwing it all away for some one-night escape? His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone, his thumb hovering over Sarah's name in the contacts. He wanted to call her, demand an explanation, yell at her until he couldn't anymore. But no. That wouldn't help. Not yet. Instead, he called his brother, David. "I'm going to need your help," Michael said, his voice flat and emotionless, masking the storm raging beneath. David's response was immediate. "Whatever you need, Mike. I'm with you. I need you to make sure James is following Sarah and Ryan tonight. I want to know everything they do, where they go, what happens." David's sigh came through the phone. "I've already talked to James. He's ready. We'll get everything." Michael thanked him and hung up. This wasn't just about finding out the truth now, it was about taking back control. He couldn't let Sarah's betrayal be the end of him. Not like this. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah was preparing for her night with Ryan. As she stood in front of her mirror, carefully selecting a dress she had never worn for Michael, a storm of emotions swirled inside her. Guilt gnawed at her insides, but there was also something else, excitement. She hated herself for feeling it, but she couldn't deny the sense of anticipation building. This was her chance to feel alive again, to reclaim the parts of herself she thought had been lost over the years. She texted Ryan, confirming the time for their date. Ryan's response was swift, "Can't wait to see you tonight." Sarah stared at the message for a moment, her heart racing. She closed her eyes, trying to push the guilt away. "It's just one night," she repeated to herself. One night, and then she'd go back to Michael, try to fix things. But she knew deep down that something had already shifted, something she could never fully repair. That evening, James Foster sat in his car outside Ryan's office building, camera ready, prepared to document every detail of the night. Michael had given him strict orders. No matter what happened, he wanted it all on record. It didn't take long before he spotted Ryan and Sarah leaving the building together. James followed at a safe distance as they made their way to a restaurant downtown. At the same time, Michael sat in his hotel room, staring blankly at the TV, though he wasn't really watching. His mind was elsewhere, picturing Sarah with Ryan, wondering what they were doing, what they were talking about. Every scenario that played out in his head was more painful than the last. As the evening wore on, James continued to shadow Sarah and Ryan. The couple started with a casual dinner, their conversation light at first. But as the wine flowed, their body language became more intimate, touching hands, leaning closer, exchanging flirtatious smiles. James' camera captured every moment. After dinner, they left the restaurant and walked along the riverfront, the tension between them palpable. They stopped at a bench, and Ryan pulled Sarah into an embrace. James' camera clicked furiously as they kissed, their lips meeting in what was clearly more than just a friendly gesture. Back in his hotel, Michael's phone buzzed with a message from David. It was a text with a single photo attached, a picture of Sarah and Ryan kissing, illuminated by the soft glow of the riverfront lights. Michael's heart felt like it had been ripped from his chest. His worst fears, now confirmed. He stared at the photo, the image of Sarah in the arms of another man burning into his mind. His hand shook as he put the phone down. He couldn't just sit here and do nothing. He had to act. The rage that had been simmering inside him since the night before boiled over. Michael grabbed his car keys and stormed out of the hotel. He knew exactly where he was going, to Ryan's house. But not to confront Ryan. No, Michael had a different plan in mind. He was going to Ryan's wife, Lydia. If Sarah thought she could destroy their marriage, then Michael was ready to deliver the same devastation to Ryan's. Lydia answered the door, confused at the sight of Michael standing on her porch. "Michael? What's going on?" Michael's voice was cold, controlled, despite the fury bubbling beneath the surface. "You need to know what your husband has been doing." He handed her his phone, showing her the photo of Ryan and Sarah together. Lydia's face turned pale as she scrolled through the images, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Michael watched her closely, feeling a twisted satisfaction in her reaction. If he was going to be in pain, so would Ryan. "I'm sorry, Lydia," Michael said, though there was little sympathy in his voice. "I thought you should know." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but behind them was a fire of her own, a fire that matched Michael's. "This isn't the first time," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of sadness and anger. "He's done this before. But I never had proof, until now." Michael nodded. "I'm not letting him get away with it this time." Lydia's tears dried quickly, replaced by a steely resolve. "Neither am I." As they stood there on the porch, the weight of betrayal hung heavily between them. Two people whose lives had been shattered by the same man and woman. But in this moment, they were united by a common goal, revenge. While Michael and Lydia made plans of their own, Sarah was oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. She returned home from her date feeling exhilarated, the thrill of the night still buzzing in her veins. Yet as she stepped inside the house, guilt began to creep back in. She had crossed a line she never thought she would, but she convinced herself that Michael would forgive her eventually. After all, it was just one night, wasn't it? Little did she know, the consequences of her actions were already in motion, and nothing in her life would ever be the same again. As the clock struck midnight, Michael sat in his car outside Ryan's home, waiting for Lydia to return after confronting her husband. The satisfaction of his plan working so smoothly gave him an unexpected sense of calm, but beneath it lay a simmering anger, a fury that was far from sated. His mind buzzed with thoughts of Sarah, how she could have done this to him, to their family. Lydia emerged from the house an hour later, her face flushed with rage. She climbed into Michael's car, slamming the door shut, her breathing heavy with emotion. "It's done," she said flatly. "I told him it's over. I showed him the pictures, and he didn't even try to deny it." Michael turned toward her, his expression hard. "What did he say?" Lydia let out a bitter laugh. "He said it was just a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. The same lies he's fed me before. But this time, I didn't listen. I told him I'm filing for divorce. He can keep his excuses, I'm done." Michael nodded, feeling a strange sense of solidarity with Lydia. She was a woman who had suffered similar betrayal, and now, they were both seeking justice in their own way. Good. He deserves everything coming to him. "And what about Sarah?" Lydia asked, her eyes narrowing. "What are you going to do?" Michael clenched his jaw. "I'm not done yet." The truth was, Michael hadn't yet decided what his next move with Sarah would be. The photo of her with Ryan still burned in his mind, and though he had exposed Ryan to Lydia, the thought of confronting Sarah himself felt too painful, too raw. But he couldn't avoid it forever. He would have to face her soon. Meanwhile, Sarah sat at home, oblivious to the chaos her actions had unleashed. She had taken a long shower after returning from her date with Ryan, trying to wash away the guilt that clung to her skin. But no matter how hard she scrubbed, the shame wouldn't disappear. She had told herself it was just one night, that it would be harmless, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. As she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space where Michael should have been, she felt a pang of regret. She hadn't heard from him since he stormed out the night before, and that worried her. In her heart, she hoped that they could talk, that she could somehow explain herself and make him understand. But how do you explain something like this? She texted him once again, "Michael, we need to talk. Please come home." But Michael didn't respond. His silence weighed on her like a heavy stone, amplifying her guilt with every passing minute. While Sarah waited anxiously, unaware of the storm brewing, Michael was plotting his next move. His brother David called him the following morning, offering advice. "You have the evidence, Mike. You've already hit Ryan where it hurts. But now you need to deal with Sarah. What are you going to do?" Michael took a deep breath, feeling the bitterness harden inside him. "I'm going to show her what it feels like." That evening, Michael put his plan into action. Instead of heading home, he went to a high-end escort service in the city. His decision was cold, calculated. He wanted to make Sarah feel the same kind of pain he was feeling, to show her that she wasn't the only one who could destroy their marriage with a single act. He hired a young, attractive woman, someone who looked nothing like Sarah, someone who could help him forget, even if just for a few hours. It wasn't about attraction or desire, it was about revenge. As they arrived back at the house, Michael felt a dark satisfaction in knowing what Sarah would walk into. The house was eerily quiet when they entered. Michael led the woman upstairs to the master bedroom, setting the scene for the confrontation that was sure to follow. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the burn of the alcohol a temporary relief from the pain inside him. Just as the tension built to a breaking point, the front door creaked open. Sarah had returned. She called out for Michael, her voice filled with hesitation. The woman in Michael's bed glanced at him, sensing what was about to happen. She wasn't paid to ask questions, so she simply smiled, playing her part. Michael didn't move. He waited, listening to the sound of Sarah's footsteps growing closer. And then she appeared in the doorway. The sight before her was more than Sarah could have ever imagined. There, in their marital bed, was Michael, her husband of 20 years, lying with another woman. The image seared itself into her mind, a brutal reflection of her own betrayal, but far more visceral, far more devastating. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She felt like she was drowning in disbelief. "Michael, what are you doing?" Michael's gaze was icy, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're not the only one who needed to feel something." Sarah's knees buckled, and she stumbled back, gripping the doorframe for support. The room seemed to spin around her as the weight of what she'd done, and what she'd caused, hit her like a tidal wave. This isn't you." Michael stood, buttoning his shirt slowly, the deliberate motion only adding to the tension. "You thought I'd just sit back and let you walk all over me? That I wouldn't do something about it?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face, and she shook her head, her voice trembling. "Michael, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I thought—" "No," Michael cut her off, his tone sharp. "You didn't think. You just acted. And now you get to live with the consequences, just like I have to." The woman quietly gathered her things and slipped out of the room, leaving the two of them alone. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Michael, don't do this. I was wrong, I know that now. We can fix this, we can work through it." But Michael's heart had hardened. He looked down at her, a mix of pain and contempt in his eyes. "It's too late for that." As Sarah's world crumbled around her, the reality of what she had done set in fully. There would be no easy way out of this. No going back to the way things were. And for Michael, there was no forgiveness in sight. Sarah sat on the floor of their bedroom, her sobs choking the air as the full weight of her actions bore down on her. She had thought her one night with Ryan would be a fleeting escape, a moment of freedom to chase away the suffocating feeling that had gripped her for months. But now, staring up at Michael, her world was shattered beyond repair. Michael stood at the edge of the room, his expression cold, unrecognizable. The man she had loved, the man who had once been her rock, looked at her as if she were nothing more than a stranger. She rose to her feet, wiping her tear-streaked face, her voice breaking. "Michael, please, don't do this. Don't let this be the end. We've been together for so long. I know I've hurt you, but we can fix this. We can get through it." Michael stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. He had expected to feel some satisfaction in seeing Sarah this broken, but all he felt was a hollow emptiness. He had wanted revenge, but now that he had it, there was no triumph, no victory, only more pain. "I'm not the one who ended it, Sarah," Michael said, his voice low and controlled. "You did." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she shook her head desperately. "No, Michael. I made a mistake, but I didn't end us. Please, you have to believe me." Michael's face tightened. "Believe you? After everything? You didn't even give me a chance. You didn't come to me. You went to him." The venom in his words stung, and Sarah recoiled as if struck. "I was lost," Sarah whispered. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to reach you. Ryan was there, and I—" "Stop," Michael snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through her words. "You don't get to make excuses for this." He moved across the room, his steps deliberate, and picked up a small envelope from the nightstand. He turned and held it out toward her. Sarah looked at it with confusion and fear swirling in her eyes. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Michael's lips twitched into a bitter smile. "A letter. From me to you. Read it, and you'll understand." Sarah hesitated but took the envelope from his hand, her fingers trembling as she opened it. She pulled out the letter inside and began to read. Each word struck her like a blow. "Sarah. You told me you needed one night with Ryan to find yourself, to feel alive again. What you've never understood is that I've been alive all along. I've lived for you, for our family, for the life we built together. And now, because of your decision, you've killed that life. You aren't the woman I thought I married. You aren't the person I thought I knew. But I know who I am, and I know what I need. I need you out of my life. I need the lies, the betrayal, and the pain to end. This is my way of telling you that I'm done. We're done. You can stay in this house, but we're no longer husband and wife. You'll find my wedding ring at the bottom of this letter. Consider it a token of what's left of our marriage, nothing. Michael." Tears dripped onto the letter as Sarah read the final words. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This couldn't be happening. She looked up at Michael, her eyes wide with shock. You can't mean this," she gasped. "You can't just walk away like this." Michael's gaze didn't waver. "I've already walked away, Sarah. I walked away the moment you told me about Ryan. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Sarah's heart pounded wildly in her chest. She felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her guilt. "Please, Michael. I'll do anything. I'll never see him again. I'll go to therapy. It's too late," Michael interrupted, his voice cold. "I don't want your promises. I don't trust you anymore." Sarah crumpled to the floor once more, clutching the letter to her chest as if it could somehow undo the damage. "Please. I'm begging you." Michael turned and walked out of the room without looking back, leaving Sarah alone in the cold silence of their home, her world crumbling around her. The door closed behind him with a finality that sent a chill through her. She was truly alone now. The sound of his footsteps faded down the stairs, and as they did, Sarah realized that she had lost him. The next day dawned in cold silence, the weight of the previous night still lingering in the air. Sarah woke up in the same clothes she had worn the night before, her body drained and exhausted. The house felt empty, as if the warmth had been sucked out with Michael's departure. She had cried herself to sleep, but there were no more tears left now, only a hollow, aching void where her marriage once stood. She stumbled out of bed and found Michael's wedding ring on the nightstand, lying next to the crumpled letter. Her fingers traced the smooth metal, the ring now a symbol of everything she had thrown away. She tried to imagine how things had gotten to this point, but it was all too blurry, too painful to grasp. Sarah picked up her phone and stared at Michael's number, her thumb hovering over the call button. She wanted to hear his voice, to plead with him one last time, but something stopped her. She knew that no matter what she said, it wouldn't matter. Michael had made his decision, and it was final. She had pushed him too far, and now there was no going back. Downstairs, she found the house eerily quiet. The remnants of the life they had built together, family photos, shared memories, the kitchen table where they had spent countless meals, felt foreign, like relics from a life she no longer belonged to. Every corner of the house reminded her of the man she had lost, and it made her chest tighten with regret. Meanwhile, Michael was sitting in a cafe across town, staring into a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. His mind was numb, the events of the last 2 days replaying in a vicious loop. He had expected to feel relief after confronting Sarah, after breaking free from the betrayal that had shattered his world. But instead, he felt a deep, gnawing emptiness. David sat across from him, watching his brother with concern. "You don't have to stay in that house, you know," David said gently. "You can move out for a while, get some space. Sarah can stay there if that's what you want." Michael rubbed his temples, exhaustion lining his face. "I don't know what I want anymore, David. Part of me just wants to get out of town, leave everything behind." David nodded, understanding. "Take your time, Mike. Don't make any decisions you'll regret. You've been through hell." Michael didn't respond. His mind wandered to Sarah, to the life they had shared, and the person she had become. He had loved her, trusted her, and in return, she had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Yet, even after everything, he couldn't completely shut off his feelings. The love was still there, buried beneath the pain, and that was the hardest part. How could he move forward when a piece of him still held on to the woman she used to be? Back at the house, Sarah decided to do the one thing she hadn't done in months, call her sister, Lisa. Lisa was the only person who might understand, the only one who would listen without judgment. She dialed the number, her hands trembling as she held the phone to her ear. "Sarah?" Lisa's voice was a mix of surprise and concern. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "No, Lisa, I'm not," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I've ruined everything. I don't know what to do." "Tell me what happened," Lisa urged, her tone soft but firm. Sarah took a deep breath and recounted everything, her growing distance from Michael, her affair with Ryan, and the devastating confrontation that followed. By the time she finished, her voice was hoarse, and her heart felt even heavier than before. "Sarah, I don't know what to say," Lisa said after a long pause. "What were you thinking? How could you do this to Michael?" "I don't know," Sarah sobbed. "I was lost. I felt like I couldn't talk to him, and Ryan was there, and I made the worst mistake of my life." Lisa sighed deeply. "Sarah, you have to understand that this might be something you can't fix. Michael may never forgive you." "I know," Sarah whispered. "But I don't know how to live without him." "Then you need to give him space. You've already hurt him more than you realize. He needs time, and you have to respect that." Sarah nodded, though Lisa couldn't see her. "I'll try." As Sarah hung up the phone, a wave of hopelessness washed over her. She had tried to salvage what was left of her marriage, but she knew deep down that it might be too late. Michael's coldness the night before had been more than just anger, it was the severing of something deeper, something that might never heal. That evening, Michael returned to the house, his face emotionless as he stepped through the front door. Sarah was sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying, but she didn't speak. She knew better than to try. Michael glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable, before heading upstairs. He moved with a mechanical precision, as if going through the motions of a life that no longer held meaning. Sarah watched him, her heart aching, but she stayed silent. Later that night, Michael came back downstairs, his face set in stone. He walked over to Sarah, standing before her with an air of finality. "I don't see you as my wife anymore," he said, his voice cold but calm. "We'll live in the same house, but we're done. We'll be nothing more than roommates from now on." Sarah's breath hitched, her chest tightening with fear. "Michael, please, don't say that." "It's not a request," he replied, his eyes locked onto hers. "If you stay, this is how it's going to be. I've already moved on, Sarah. You should too." With that, Michael turned and walked away, leaving Sarah sitting in stunned silence, the weight of his words crashing down on her. She had hoped for a chance to rebuild, to find some way to earn his forgiveness, but now she realized that the man she had known for 20 years was truly gone. All that remained was the shell of their life together, a fragile arrangement built on the ruins of trust. And as Sarah sat there, staring into the empty space where her future had once been, she wondered if she had lost more than just her marriage, she had lost herself. Months passed, and the once vibrant Thompson household had become a cold, lifeless place, occupied by two people who were little more than strangers. Sarah and Michael went through the motions, sharing the same space but leading entirely separate lives. Their conversations were brief, limited to logistics about the house or their daughters, Emily and Olivia, who remained unaware of the turmoil back home. Sarah had thrown herself into her work, hoping to distract herself from the crushing weight of her guilt and the emptiness that had settled over her life. But no matter how many deals she closed, no matter how successful she became in real estate, it wasn't enough to fill the void Michael had left. Every day, she was reminded of the distance between them, and every night, she lay in bed alone, haunted by the memory of the man she had once loved. Michael, on the other hand, had retreated deeper into his world. He spent more time at the office, expanding his landscaping business and avoiding home as much as possible. When he was at the house, he kept his interactions with Sarah minimal, his focus entirely on maintaining a civil but distant cohabitation. The pain of her betrayal had hardened into something colder, more impenetrable, a wall that Sarah couldn't break through. They had agreed to attend marriage counseling, but the sessions had been fruitless. Michael remained closed off, unwilling to let his guard down, while Sarah poured out her regrets, trying to explain herself in the hope that something, anything, might reach him. But Michael's trust in her was shattered beyond repair. Each session felt like a futile attempt to piece together something that was already irreversibly broken. At home, Michael had installed a GPS tracker on Sarah's phone, a condition of their fragile arrangement. He demanded complete transparency, no more secrets, no more lies. Sarah had agreed without protest, knowing it was her only way to prove she had nothing to hide. But even as she complied with every demand, she felt the weight of their estrangement pressing down on her. Michael's coldness was a constant reminder that forgiveness was far from reach. One evening, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, staring at her phone. Her daughters had called earlier, excited about their upcoming visit home for the holidays, but Sarah could barely muster the energy to respond with enthusiasm. She missed them deeply, and she dreaded the moment they would come home and sense the rift between her and Michael. How could they explain what had happened? How could they pretend that everything was fine? Michael walked into the kitchen, his face expressionless as he grabbed a glass of water. He didn't acknowledge Sarah, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. "Michael," she said quietly, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking, maybe we should talk. About us. About where we go from here." He didn't look at her as he responded, his voice clipped. "There's nothing to talk about. We already agreed on how this is going to work." "But this isn't working," Sarah said, her desperation evident. "We can't go on like this. It's tearing both of us apart." Michael finally looked at her, his eyes cold and distant. "It's already over, Sarah. We're just going through the motions. I don't feel anything for you anymore." The words cut deep, but Sarah refused to give up. "There has to be a way to fix this," she pleaded. "I know I made a terrible mistake, but I'm trying to make it right." Michael shook his head. "You can't make it right. What's done is done." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "So, what? We just live like this forever?" pretending everything's fine when it's not. Michael's expression didn't change. That's up to you. If you want to stay, you stay. If you want to leave, you leave. I don't care anymore. The coldness in his words was more than Sarah could bear. She had hoped for a breakthrough, for some sign that Michael might still have a sliver of love left for her, but now she realized that he had already moved on in his mind. There was nothing left to fight for. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't break down in front of him again. She had done enough of that. Instead, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I'll stay. For the girls. But I don't know how long I can live like this. Michael didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah alone once more. Meanwhile, Ryan's life had unraveled completely. After Lydia had confronted him with the evidence of his affair, she had filed for divorce, and Ryan had been left to deal with the wreckage of his actions. He lost custody of his children, his home, and much of his reputation in the process. The affair with Sarah had cost him more than he could have ever imagined, and now he was paying the price. Michael took some satisfaction in knowing that Ryan had faced consequences, but it did little to ease the lingering pain in his own life. The damage had been done, and there was no undoing it. As time passed, Sarah and Michael continued their fragile arrangement. They lived in the same house, shared the same space, but the love they once had was gone. Sarah tried her best to rebuild their connection, but Michael remained distant, unwilling to open his heart again. The months stretched on, and though they remained married in name, they were nothing more than two people bound by the remnants of a life they had once shared. The trust that had been shattered would never fully heal, and both of them knew it. And so, they continued forward, caught in the fragile balance of their new reality, haunted by the ghosts of what they had lost, and uncertain of what the future held.